Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine for a moment stepping into the grand halls of the United Nations, a global stage where nations, big and small, articulate their histories, defend their present, and lay out their vision for the future. It's a place where, diplomatic language often masks profound grievances and where every statement is a really strategic act. Today, we're taking a deep dive into precisely such a moment, examining a powerful and, frankly, pretty compelling statement delivered by a representative from Eritrea at the United Nations speaking about the human rights situation in their country. Our mission isn't just to summarize, it's to excavate Eritrea's unique and, well, often misunderstood perspective on its relationship with international human rights mechanisms and the broader UN system. We'll be navigating their carefully constructed arguments, tracing their deep historical grievances, and trying to understand their very specific vision for how constructive international engagement should unfold. All of this drawn from the layers of this single, crucial document.
What's truly fascinating here is observing how a sovereign nation articulates its lived experience within a global framework, especially when that experience is fraught with perceived injustices. This statement, it really transcends a mere human rights report. It's a profound window into the enduring complexities of national sovereignty, the fraught landscape of international accountability, and, frankly, the wildly varying interpretations of justice itself. For you, our listener, this deep dive offers a critical, almost surgical look at how these high-stakes conversations unfold on the world stage and what deeply rooted national narratives truly inform a country's diplomatic stance. It forces us to question not just what is being said, but why it's being said with such, well, conviction.
So what does this all mean for understanding international relations, for interpreting human rights discourse, and for appreciating the intricate dance between global ideals and national realities? Let's dive in. The moment you begin reading this statement, it's clear Eritrea isn't holding back. Not at all. It opens with an unequivocal, almost blistering rejection of a recent report from a UN Special Rapporteur. This isn't just a nuanced disagreement. It's a fundamental challenge to the report's very legitimacy, its foundational principles. So what are the core bedrock criticisms Eritrea levels against this particular report?
Well, this immediately raises an important, maybe even existential question about the methodology and objectivity of these kinds of international reports, which are really meant to be pillars of unbiased assessment. Eritrea's representative made it explicitly clear that they refuse to, and I quote, waste time refuting the report point by point. Now, this isn't a casual dismissal, far from it. Instead, it's a highly strategic and pointed refusal stemming from their profound belief that the report, much like its predecessors stretching back over a decade, is inherently irredeemably flawed. Their argument is that the issues with the report are so deeply foundational, so ingrained in its very motive, content, and methodology, that engaging in a line-by-line refutation would, well, inadvertently lend it a legitimacy, a semblance of factual accuracy, that Eritrea believes it absolutely does not deserve. They see it as a waste of their diplomatic capital to dignify what they perceive as, essentially, a baseless document.
Right, so they're saying engaging with it on its own terms gives it credibility it doesn't warrant.
Exactly. And at the core of their criticism, and indeed a significant point for anyone assessing the credibility of international documents, revolves around the source material that the Special Rapporteur relies upon. Eritrea contends that the report is built predominantly, if not entirely, upon unverifiable claims and biased assessments. And this isn't just a vague accusation lobbed casually. They specify that the sources are described as anonymous and, crucially, are consistently located outside Eritrea. This geographical and, more significantly, procedural separation, combined with the anonymity, becomes a major point of contention for them. Eritrea argues that the identities, affiliations, and motivations of these sources remain undisclosed, making it impossible for them, or indeed any objective third party, to independently verify the veracity or the intent behind the claims.
And why is that lack of disclosure, that inability to scrutinize the sources, such a fundamental and critical problem for Eritrea? What does it prevent, in their view?
It's critical because without that foundational information, without the ability to know who is providing these claims, what their background is, or what their potential agendas might be, Eritrea argues it prevents any form of scrutiny. Think about it. In any journalistic endeavor, in any academic research, or certainly in any legal proceeding, source transparency and verifiability are, well, paramount for establishing credibility. When you can't scrutinize the sources, you effectively cannot assess potential biases, vested interests, or even the basic accuracy of the information being provided. This, Eritrea asserts, fundamentally undermines the report's ability to be considered objective, transparent, accountable, or balanced. They see it not just as a procedural oversight, but as a direct challenge to the very principles of fair assessment and due process that a UN human rights report should embody. It suggests, from their perspective, a deliberate intent to present a particular narrative without being subject to independent verification.
So it's not just a disagreement with the report's findings, but a fundamental challenge to the entire process, the nature of the evidence, and the very integrity of the information gathering. And what's particularly striking is that Eritrea isn't just saying this specific report is flawed. They're claiming it actively contradicts information from other UN bodies. That implies a deeper systemic issue within the international framework itself, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This is a fascinating and deeply concerning point, as it highlights a potential internal inconsistency, even a fragmentation within the broader UN system itself. Eritrea points out that the Special Rapporteur's report, quote, directly contradicts the verifiable and comprehensive reports regularly submitted by various UN agencies operating within Eritrea. Now, that's a significant and powerful claim because it suggests that different parts of the United Nations system, even those with a physical presence and ongoing operations on the ground in the country, might be coming to different conclusions or collecting data using vastly different methodologies. For you, the listener, this isn't just about Eritrea's perspective. It demands a critical recognition that even within a single, vast international organization like the UN, there can be differing perspectives, specific mandates, and indeed often conflicting findings when assessing the situation in a particular nation.
So what does that internal divergence mean for the credibility of UN reporting overall?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Does it allow states to sort of selectively engage with reports they find favorable while dismissing others? Or does it, conversely, demand a more integrated, coherent approach from the UN itself, perhaps a more unified methodology across its various agencies to prevent such apparent contradictions? This isn't just about Eritrea's immediate rebuttal. It challenges the very architecture of international accountability and the coherence of information disseminated by global bodies. It implies a fragmented picture, where one report might focus on alleged violations derived from external, anonymous sources, while others are documenting tangible development efforts, public health improvements, or successful poverty reduction programs based on internal data and on-the-ground observations. This internal UN tension adds a profound layer of complexity to the human rights discussion, suggesting that even official reports can have varying degrees of alignment, and that their specific mandate and methodologies must always be critically considered.
Okay, this isn't just a critique of a single recent report then. Eritrea ties it back to a much larger, almost epic historical narrative. They frame it as a pattern of deep-seated injustice and inconsistency that has plagued their relationship with the UN for decades. They paint a picture that stretches back to their very genesis as a nation, suggesting that their current challenges with the UN's human rights mechanisms are not isolated incidents, but rather the latest chapter in a long, uncomfortable truth for them. So let's go back in time. Where does this uncomfortable truth truly begin for them in their historical account with the UN?
Right. If we truly connect this to the bigger historical picture, Eritrea's statement presents a powerful, albeit from their specific viewpoint, recounting of its historical interactions with the UN. This narrative suggests that the organization's founding ideals, noble as they may be, have been either inconsistently applied or outright denied to Eritrea throughout its modern history. This provides the crucial, often overlooked context for their current deep skepticism and their very specific approach to engaging with international bodies today. It effectively sets the stage for why they view specific mandates, particularly those they deem externally imposed, with such deep-seated distrust. They are essentially arguing that the UN's historical actions, or critically, inactions, have profoundly shaped their national psyche and their approach to global governance, leading to a lingering sense of historical grievance.
And where does that grievance really start?
Well, the statement reaches all the way back to the dawn of their nation's post-colonial era, to a pivotal moment in 1952. This is where Eritrea claims its right to decolonization was subverted under the auspices of the UN. To understand the weight of this claim, we must remember the global context. After World War II, many colonies were transitioning to independence. Eritrea, a former Italian colony, found its fate debated by the international community. Instead of being granted the immediate, outright independence that many other colonies were achieving, Eritrea asserts it was forcibly federated with another country, namely Ethiopia, through UN General Assembly Resolution 390V. This act, in their view, was a direct violation of the UN Charter, which was established in part to uphold the fundamental principle of self-determination for all peoples.
So they're arguing the UN itself undermined their independence from the very start.
That's precisely their point. The implication here is profound. Eritrea believes that the very body meant to uphold the sovereignty and self-determination of nations played a direct role in undermining their nascent independence from the outset. This wasn't merely a failure to act, but an active intervention that, for them, steered their destiny away from genuine self-governance. The federation, designed perhaps as a compromise, was perceived by many Eritreans as a thinly veiled annexation, setting a precedent of perceived UN complicity in historical grievances rather than being a guarantor of their rights. For them, it wasn't a failure to act, it was an action that was detrimental to their future, sowing the seeds of conflict from day one. This initial compromise, viewed through Eritrea's lens, was a profound betrayal of their aspirations for full independence.
And it seems that perceived complicity, or at least a devastating inaction, didn't end there. The narrative deepens with an even more direct perceived betrayal. What happened next in this searing historical account in 1962?
Following that initial flawed federation, the situation for Eritrea escalated dramatically in 1962. The federation itself was unilaterally dissolved by the Ethiopian government, and Eritrea was then forcibly annexed and incorporated as a province of Ethiopia. What's absolutely critical in Eritrea's historical grievance here is their assertion that the UN's silence amounted to complicity. They argue that the international body, which had overseen and essentially sanctioned the initial already problematic federation, then stood by idly doing nothing, as that arrangement was dismantled and their country was absorbed by its much larger neighbor.
So inaction is complicity.
Yes. This inaction in Eritrea's powerful narrative was not merely passive observation or diplomatic impotence. It was an implicit endorsement, or at the very least, a catastrophic failure to prevent, an act that set the stage for decades of conflict and suffering. The argument here is deeply compelling, that inaction can be just as detrimental, if not more so, than direct negative intervention, especially when it involves fundamental principles of sovereignty, self-determination, and international law. For Eritrea, the UN's passivity at this critical juncture directly led to the outbreak of the Eritrean War of Independence, a brutal 30-year conflict that resulted in immense loss of life and prolonged hardship. This historical moment cemented a deep-seated grievance and reinforced their belief in the UN's inconsistent, even cynical application of its own foundational principles when it came to their nation's fate. It underscores a profound sense of abandonment by the international body that was supposed to protect them.
That's a truly powerful accusation, suggesting the UN, through omission, directly contributed to decades of their suffering. And this pattern, as Eritrea sees it, continued even after their independence was finally achieved, particularly concerning their border dispute in 2002. It highlights a persistent tension between international legal pronouncements and their actual enforcement.
Yes, the narrative of betrayal or neglect clearly continues into the post-independence era, demonstrating a persistent sense of frustration with the UN's capacity or willingness to follow through on its own resolutions. In 2002, Eritrea highlights a critical moment concerning the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission's final and binding decision. Now, this was not just any decision. It was the outcome of a legally binding arbitration process established under the 2000 Algiers Agreement, aimed at definitively resolving the contentious border dispute that had led to the devastating 1998-2000 border war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. The EEBC, an independent body, issued its decision clearly delimiting and demarcating the border.
A final and binding decision should have settled it right.
You'd think so. However, despite this clear legal ruling, Eritrea states that the UN Security Council failed to enforce it. And importantly, they don't attribute this failure to a lack of capability on the Council's part or an inability to mobilize resources. They explicitly declare it was a failure of responsibility, not capacity. This distinction is absolutely crucial. It implies a deliberate political choice, or perhaps a profound lack of political will among powerful UN members, rather than an objective inability to act. This failure to enforce a legally binding decision, Eritrea argues, directly led to Years of military tension, economic hardship, and regional instability. For decades, this created a no-war, no-peace stalemate, severely hindering Eritrea's development, forcing a continuous state of high military readiness and exacerbating economic strain. For you, the listener, this reveals a significant, often frustrating gap that can exist between international law and its effective enforcement. A decision might be legally binding on paper, but without the resolute political will from key international actors, its impact can be negligible, leaving a nation to bear the devastating and prolonged consequences. It underscores that international justice isn't solely about legal pronouncements, but profoundly about their practical and political application.
So a pattern emerges. Legal decisions are made, but not enforced, leading to very real, tangible consequences for Eritrea's stability and development. And then the narrative shifts from inaction or a lack of enforcement to what Eritrea describes as direct, unjust, punitive measures. What happened in 2009, and how did this further cement their perception of being unfairly targeted by the UN?
Right. In 2009, Eritrea states that the Security Council directly imposed sanctions on Eritrea through Resolution 1907. And crucially, they assert these sanctions were based on unsubstantiated, politically motivated allegations, primarily linking them to alleged support for al-Shabaab in Somalia and non-compliance with the Djibouti peace process. This is a very strong claim, suggesting that the international community's actions were driven by political agendas and geopolitical interests rather than clear, verifiable evidence or an impartial assessment of the facts. Adding significantly to their grievance, Eritrea claims it was denied due process and the right to reply. To be denied due process in an international forum means Eritrea felt it was deprived of fundamental rights such as the right to present its own evidence, to formally respond to specific allegations, or to have a fair hearing of its case before sanctions were imposed. These are principles considered bedrock to justice, even at the international level, and Eritrea's assertion challenges the legitimacy of the Security Council's decision-making process itself.
And the impact of those sanctions.
While the consequences, they state, were severe and prolonged, these unjust sanctions and political isolation persisted for nearly 2 decades. This highlights the profound, multifaceted impact of international sanctions. Beyond the immediate economic strain from arms embargoes, travel bans, and financial restrictions, there was also a pervasive political isolation. This deeply hindered Eritrea's ability to engage with the global community, to attract investment, to foster trade, and ultimately to develop its infrastructure and economy. The claim of politically motivated allegations and the denial of due process points to a perceived politicization of UN mechanisms, suggesting that global power dynamics can, from a nation's perspective, override principles of fairness and accountability, leading to prolonged suffering and marginalization for a nation, regardless of the veracity of the underlying claims. It profoundly impacted Eritrea's capacity for self-reliance and progress.
And this brings us closer to the present, where Eritrea feels this pattern of unfair targeting has continued, particularly within the human rights machinery of the UN. How does Eritrea describe its experience within this specific framework since 2012, and how does it kind of culminate this long history of grievances?
This period, spanning from 2012 to the present, culminates Eritrea's extensive historical grievances, effectively framing the current human rights mandates as the latest, most persistent iteration of a long-standing pattern of what they perceive as unfair treatment and profound disregard for their national sovereignty. They state that the human rights machinery followed suit, intensifying the pressure with the introduction of country-specific resolutions, the establishment of a commission of inquiry, and the continuous appointment of special rapporteurs specifically for Eritrea. These are distinct mechanisms. Country-specific resolutions are often politically charged statements by member states. Commissions of inquiry are high-level investigative bodies, and special rapporteurs are independent experts, as we discussed earlier. From Eritrea's perspective, these diverse mechanisms have collectively subjected the nation to deliberate and consistent campaigns of vilification for the last 13 years. This isn't just a critique of specific reports or individual findings. It's a deep-seated feeling of being under a sustained, targeted, and coordinated attack on their international reputation and their fundamental legitimacy on the global stage.
It sounds like they felt completely besieged by these different mechanisms.
That's certainly the impression given. What's particularly poignant in their statement about this period is the profound sense of being ignored, misunderstood, and fundamentally disrespected. They emphasize that throughout these 13 years of intense scrutiny, their repeated calls for engagement, dialogue, and technical cooperation were consistently dismissed. This implies a profound frustration with the perceived one-way street of international engagement, where criticisms were levied without a genuine willingness from these external bodies to engage constructively or collaboratively with the Eritrean government itself. This persistent dismissal, they argue, led to a deeper, more profound affront. Our sovereignty was disregarded and our dignity trampled. This isn't just about policy disagreements or factual disputes. It's framed as a profound violation of their national identity, their hard-won independence, and their inherent right to self-governance. It suggests a deep-seated distrust of these specific UN mechanisms, viewing them not as impartial tools for genuine human rights promotion, but rather as instruments of political pressure designed to undermine the state, rather than support its internal development or engage on its own terms. They feel these mandates have actively worked against their efforts to build and develop their nation, rather than assisting them, further cementing their long-held grievances against the UN system.
Despite this incredibly challenging and, in their narrative, unjust historical experience, Eritrea emphasizes an unwavering commitment to its own citizens and outlines its ongoing efforts in both domestic development and international engagement. It's almost a deliberate counter-narrative to the external criticisms we've just discussed, showing they're not simply rejecting engagement, but perhaps seeking a very different kind of engagement. What exactly are they highlighting as their own priorities and proactive steps, aiming to paint a picture of internal progress and a willingness to cooperate on their own terms?
Yes, this section is absolutely crucial because it presents Eritrea's powerful counter-narrative, showing their clear intent to demonstrate a commitment to internal progress and responsible global citizenship, even while they vehemently challenge external criticisms. It's about how a nation, under such scrutiny, strategically wants to be seen on the global stage, emphasizing its internal focus and its preferred modes of international interaction. While they are highly critical of certain UN mechanisms, they are simultaneously asserting their own dedication to national development and their expressed willingness to engage with other, what they deem, more legitimate and respectful international avenues. This highlights a nuanced rather than outright rejectionist approach.
So what are those internal priorities?
Well, first and foremost, Eritrea states that it remains unwavering in its dedication to enhancing the lives of its citizens. This is framed as their primary internally focused commitment, the core of their national project. To achieve this, they emphasize that they prioritize substantial investments in what they consider critical sectors for human well-being and national progress. The statement specifically highlights significant commitment to education, healthcare, gender equity, and sustainable development. These are broad areas that reflect a holistic approach to human capital development and long-term societal well-being, which they view as foundational to their citizens' rights. For you, the listener, this offers a different perspective from the more direct, often narrow criticisms levied in external reports about alleged civil and political rights violations. It suggests that while external bodies might focus on those areas, Eritrea itself asserts a primary focus on fundamental socioeconomic upliftment, which they view as equally, if not more, essential to their citizens' human rights. This highlights a potential divergence in priorities, or a difference in the scope of what constitutes human rights in practice, a focus on foundational socioeconomic rights alongside civil and political ones.
So they're essentially saying, look at what we are doing internally to uplift our people. But they're also keenly emphasizing their willingness to engage internationally, just on their own very specific terms. How are they actively fostering meaningful dialogue and cooperation? And with whom are they choosing to engage, thereby drawing a clear distinction from the mechanisms they reject?
Yes, that's precisely the sophisticated distinction they're drawing in their diplomatic strategy. Eritrea claims to be fostering opportunities for meaningful dialogue with all states and partners, but they stipulate very clear and non-negotiable criteria for this engagement. It must be based on good faith, mutual respect, and shared interests. This implies that the dialogue they seek is fundamentally collaborative and reciprocal, not confrontational, not prescriptive, and certainly not hierarchical, with one party dictating terms or unilaterally passing judgment. They are signaling that they are open to international cooperation, but only under conditions that affirm their sovereignty and dignity and that acknowledge them as an equal partner in the discussion.
And they provide examples of this kind of engagement.
They do. To illustrate this commitment and to provide concrete evidence for their selective engagement, they point to their active participation in several existing international human rights mechanisms, which they presumably view as meeting their criteria of legitimacy and mutual respect. This includes their active participation in the Universal Periodic Review, UPR, which is a unique and often preferred process for many nations. The UPR is a peer review mechanism of the UN Human Rights Council, where the human rights records of all UN member states are examined every few years by other states, rather than by an independent expert. It's often seen as a more legitimate channel because it's universal, state-driven, and theoretically fosters dialogue and recommendations from fellow nations rather than unilateral condemnation. They also highlight their active participation in African Union human rights mechanisms, which might be seen as a regional preference or a belief in mechanisms closer to home, perhaps seen as understanding regional contexts better. Furthermore, they engage in technical cooperation with various UN agencies, indicating a willingness to work with UN bodies on specific development or humanitarian projects where the engagement is practical and mutually beneficial rather than oversight-focused.
Interesting. So they are engaging, just not with a special rapporteur.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more specific and very current, providing a powerful piece of counter-evidence to the narrative of non-cooperation. The statement explicitly mentions that just last week, Eritrea hosted in Asmara a retreat of regional directors of various UN agencies. This wasn't just any high-level meeting. It significantly included the regional director of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This specific detail is a powerful piece of evidence in their argument. It directly contradicts the notion that they are entirely closed off to human rights engagement or the UN system in general. It demonstrates that they are engaging with human rights mechanisms in UN bodies, but selectively choosing those they deem legitimate multilateral channels and rejecting others they perceive as politically motivated or lacking the requisite good faith and respect. For you, the listener, this highlights the critical distinction a nation can make between different types of international engagement. It's not a blanket rejection of human rights discussion, but rather a nuanced strategic approach that prioritizes engagement they deem respectful and constructive over those they feel are punitive, biased, or an infringement on their sovereignty. It underscores that for many nations, the how of international engagement is as important, if not more important, than the what.
It seems like Eritrea is drawing a very clear, bold line in the sand regarding how international engagement should happen. They're not rejecting the concept of human rights outright, which is a critical point. Instead, they are very particular about the channels, the methodology, and the fundamental spirit of that engagement. What then is their core philosophical stance on human rights? And where do they see the fundamental tension lying between universal ideals and national sovereignty?
This section truly reveals Eritrea's fundamental conceptual framework, which is crucial for understanding their entire diplomatic posture. They're emphatically not rejecting human rights outright. That's a critical nuance that often gets lost in simplified narratives. Instead, they are incredibly specific about the terms of engagement, raising profound questions about national sovereignty in a globalized world, particularly when it intersects with what they perceive as external mandates. They are, in essence, stating, we believe in human rights and are committed to them domestically, but we fundamentally reject certain ways they are being externally imposed or assessed, which we see as undermining our statehood.
So engagement is okay, but it has to be on their terms.
Essentially, yes. Eritrea explicitly states its unwavering support for constructive international engagement, but with a vital, non-negotiable caveat. This engagement must occur through legitimate multilateral channels. And the indispensable foundation for such interaction, they insist, must be based on mutual respect and equality. This is key to their philosophy. It indicates that they are looking for a genuine partnership, a dialogue among equals, rather than a hierarchical relationship where one party dictates terms, levies accusations, or passes judgment without what they consider proper deference to national sovereignty and the unique context of a nation's development. They are asserting their sovereign right to determine the terms of their engagement with international bodies, actively pushing back against what they perceive as unilateral oversight or prescriptive interventions that do not acknowledge their agency or dignity.
So if they support some forms of engagement and claim to uphold human rights internally, what specific types of mechanisms do they then unequivocally reject, and why? What's the central argument that defines this philosophical boundary for them?
This is where their philosophical stance truly crystallizes and defines their operational red lines. While they champion constructive engagement through what they term legitimate channels, they simultaneously and resolutely reject politically motivated mechanisms that they believe are driven by hostility and double standards. This phrase, politically motivated, is absolutely central to their argument and their deep-seated distrust. They are implying, in no uncertain terms, that some international human rights mechanisms are not truly impartial tools for promoting universal human rights, but rather instruments that serve ulterior political agendas of certain powerful states, or are wielded by actors with undisclosed motivations. The accusation of double standards further suggests they perceive an uneven, hypocritical application of human rights scrutiny, where some nations are targeted more harshly or unfairly than others, while others facing similar or worse conditions escape scrutiny.
And that leads to their core principle.
Exactly. This leads directly to their core principle, which is perhaps the single most critical takeaway from their entire statement and defines their philosophical battleground. Eritrea does not reject human rights. We reject their instrumentalization as weapons to undermine national sovereignty. This is a profound and vital distinction. They are drawing a clear, unambiguous line between the universal principles of human rights, which they claim to uphold and prioritize domestically through their own development efforts, and the way those principles are sometimes utilized or weaponized in the international arena. For Eritrea, when a human rights mandate is perceived as politically driven, lacking transparency, or relying on unverifiable claims, it ceases to be about genuine human rights promotion, and instead becomes, in their view, a tool for external interference, a means to exert political pressure, or even to destabilize a sovereign state under the guise of human rights concerns. For you, the listener, this offers a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the inherent and often explosive tension that can exist between universal human rights principles and the sacrosanct principle of state sovereignty. It forces us to consider whether international human rights mechanisms are always perceived as neutral and benevolent, or if they can, from a state's perspective, be seen as instruments of power politics, wielded selectively by more influential global actors. It challenges the simplistic assumption that all external oversight is inherently beneficial or unbiased, and highlights the ongoing debate about the appropriate balance between intervention and respect for national self-determination.
This philosophical stance, so deeply rooted in their perceived historical grievances, seems to culminate in a profound distrust of certain specific UN mandates. What's their ultimate message to the UN Council about this moving forward, especially as the UN approaches a significant milestone?
Indeed. Their extensive historical narrative and their tightly defined philosophical position converge into a direct, unambiguous challenge to the UN system itself, particularly as the organization approaches its 80th anniversary. Eritrea states that as the UN turns 80, the Council must not condone mandates that bypass consent, ignore context, and discard objectivity. This is a scathing, comprehensive critique of the very operational modalities and perceived flaws of certain mandates within the UN human rights machinery. The phrase bypass consent suggests they believe some mandates operate without the explicit agreement or genuine cooperation of the state being monitored, which they see as a blatant violation of a nation's sovereign right to determine its own path and engage on its own terms. Ignore context implies that the reports generated by these mandates fail to understand or account for the unique historical, cultural, socioeconomic, and geopolitical challenges a nation faces, leading to assessments that are unfair or fundamentally misinformed because they lack a holistic understanding. And discard objectivity directly ties back to their initial core criticisms of biased and unverifiable sources, arguing that the reports are not fact-based but rather driven by preconceived notions or external agendas.
And they link this to power politics within the UN.
They do explicitly. They further argue, and this is a significant accusation, that such mandates implicitly accommodate the prerogatives of certain powerful member states. This is a direct critical accusation of power imbalances and systemic biases within the UN system itself. It implies that certain mandates are not truly universal or impartial in their application, but rather serve the geopolitical interests of more powerful nations, allowing them to exert influence and pressure under the umbrella of human rights concerns, effectively using the UN as a tool for their own foreign policy objectives. It profoundly challenges the perceived neutrality and fairness of some international processes, suggesting that they are susceptible to political manipulation and selective application. For Eritrea, the call is for the UN to uphold its foundational principles of equality among member states and non-interference in internal affairs, rather than becoming a platform for selective targeting or the disproportionate exercise of power by a few. They are urging the UN to engage in serious self-reflection on its own mission and to ensure that its mechanisms truly serve the universal cause of human rights equitably and legitimately for all nations, not just the powerful.
Given all these points, their deep-seated criticisms of the Special Rapporteur's report, their long and painful historical grievances with the UN, and their very clearly articulated philosophical stance on sovereignty and engagement, what is Eritrea's ultimate, concrete ask of the UN Human Rights Council? What specific actionable outcome are they pushing for after laying out such a comprehensive and passionate case?
Right. This is precisely where all the preceding arguments, the historical narrative, and the philosophical framework converge into a direct, actionable, and politically charged request. It's not merely a critique or a lament about past injustices. It's a concrete political move within the UN system aimed at fundamentally altering their current international oversight situation. After presenting their extensive historical and philosophical arguments, Eritrea has translated their profound discontent into a very clear and unambiguous demand for action from the Council. This statement makes it unequivocally clear that Eritrea has tabled a draft resolution calling for the termination of this mandate. This is a formal diplomatic step within the UN Human Rights Council framework. They are not just requesting a review, a reform, or a modification. They are seeking the complete and immediate cessation of the Special Rapporteur's specific mandate on Eritrea. This represents a direct and audacious challenge to the Council's established procedures and powers, as such mandates are typically renewed annually. Their specific call is unambiguous, leaving no room for misinterpretation. They call on all members of this Council to terminate the Special Rapporteur mandate on Eritrea. This demonstrates their clear intent to mobilize diplomatic support among member states to achieve this outcome, effectively turning their long-held grievances into a concrete diplomatic campaign.
And what are the key overarching justifications they offer for why this mandate, in particular, should be terminated? They must have very specific and compelling reasons, given their deep-seated objections and historical narrative.
Indeed, their justification for termination is multifaceted, systematic, and directly ties back to every issue they've meticulously raised throughout their statement, forming a cohesive argument for why the mandate is not just flawed, but detrimental.
What are those main points?
Okay, firstly, they argue that the mandate has strayed far from its legal foundations. This goes beyond just a methodological complaint. It implies that the mandate is operating outside its legitimate scope or original purpose as defined by the UN Human Rights Council. It suggests that over time, through mission creep or political influence, the mandate has become overly politicized, biased, or has adopted an approach that deviates fundamentally from the principles that should govern such an international oversight role. It's a claim that the very essence of the mandate has been corrupted or distorted.
Yeah, okay, straight from its foundations. What else?
Secondly, and directly linked to their earlier foundational criticisms about methodology, sources, and transparency, they assert that the mandate has failed to produce credible findings. This is a powerful reiteration of their long-standing claim that the reports generated under this mandate utterly lack objectivity, transparency, and balance due to their reliance on what Eritrea characterizes as unverifiable and anonymous sources. If the findings themselves are not credible, if the factual basis is fundamentally challenged, then the entire exercise of the mandate becomes, in their view, futile, illegitimate, and even counterproductive. Why should international resources and diplomatic time be expended on reports that, according to the subject state, cannot be trusted?
Makes sense from their perspective. And the final point.
And finally, they make a powerful overarching claim that elevates their argument beyond mere procedural or factual disagreement. They contend that the mandate ultimately does a disservice to the cause of human rights. This is a very strong, almost paradoxical indictment from a nation that has been accused of human rights violations. It suggests that far from genuinely promoting human rights in Eritrea, this specific mandate is actively undermining them.
How could it undermine them?
Well, from Eritrea's perspective, it could be by fostering deep distrust between the state and international mechanisms, by diverting resources and attention from what Eritrea considers to be more constructive forms of engagement, like technical cooperation or dialogue, or by politically weaponizing human rights to create division and instability rather than fostering genuine improvement. This ultimate justification positions their request not as an anti-human rights stance, but rather as an argument for a more effective, legitimate, and mutually respectful approach to human rights promotion, one that prioritizes cooperation and sovereignty rather than confrontation and external imposition. For you, the listener, this illustrates how states can actively push back against international oversight mechanisms, not just by ignoring them, but by engaging in sophisticated diplomatic efforts to fundamentally dismantle them, highlighting the ongoing power struggles and intricate diplomatic efforts within the UN system.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We've taken a truly deep dive into a very specific and detailed statement from Eritrea, peeling back layers of a complex perspective on human rights, international cooperation, and a painful history of grievances. It's a powerful reminder that global discussions are rarely, if ever, black and white. They are multi-hued tapestries woven from national experience, perceived injustice, and strategic diplomatic positioning. Every nation brings its own unique historical baggage, its current domestic priorities, and its long-standing resentments to the international table. This isn't just about a report on human rights. It's about a nation articulating its identity, fiercely defending its sovereignty, and challenging the legitimacy of a multilateral system that it feels has historically, repeatedly, and profoundly failed it.
So, what does this all mean for you, our listener, as you navigate the complex world of international news? This statement fundamentally encourages, indeed demands, critical thinking about the sources of information we consume regarding international affairs. It prompts us to consider the often unseen why behind a nation's stance, even when that stance vehemently challenges established narratives or the perceived wisdom of international bodies. It forces us to reflect deeply on the inherent, often irreconcilable tensions between the universal aspirations of human rights principles and the enduring fundamental reality of national sovereignty. It really makes you consider the different lenses through which international actions are viewed and how a nation's historical experiences can profoundly, almost irrevocably, shape its current engagement or disengagement with global bodies. It reminds us that truth in international relations can be a fiercely contested space, with different actors having equally strong, albeit divergent, narratives, each convinced of the justice of their own cause.
And for a final provocative thought, if nations can fundamentally disagree not just on the factual findings of human rights reports, but on the very mechanisms for assessing human rights, on their methodology, their legitimacy, even their intent, how then can true global progress and universal understanding of human rights ever be authentically achieved? What does it truly mean for a mandate to stray from its legal foundations or to do a disservice to the cause of human rights? Is it truly possible for international bodies to be effective, to fulfill their noble mandates, if their legitimacy is fundamentally questioned and fiercely resisted by the very states they aim to assess? These are not easy questions, and there's something to mull over as you navigate the daily news and the ongoing discussions around global governance. We sincerely hope this deep dive has offered you a shortcut to being truly well-informed on this fascinating, complex, and crucially important topic.